Hi everybody, welcome to week 9, and as you know by looking at the UNO calendar, this is a short week and I'll have a little bit more to say about that later. But I want to use this lecture to talk briefly about the readings I've given you this week. And as I lead into that, what I want to say is that these readings are rich and important pieces of public administration literature. Waldo is very important to public administration, as is Simon, as are the ideas of Dahl, as he laid them out in this paper. And so I want to talk about the literature a little bit, but I want you to spend the week digesting this literature. And then I have a different kind of discussion assignment, which I'll go over at the end of the lecture. Okay, so as I said, this week, week 9 is the UNO fall break, which occurs on October 17th and 18th. That is Monday and Tuesday. So really, I need to reduce your workload. And in doing so, what I've done is the discussion will be reduced, as I'll show you on the last part of the presentation. But briefly, I am asking you to respond to some questions, but I am omitting the requirement to respond to classmates with questions or critiques, and then, of course, respond to their questions. So really all I'm asking for is some thought sharing in a different sort of way by Friday of week 9. So what's important about these readings that I've put in here? What's important is they serve as a bridge, in a sense, from classical public administration, so let's call that the Posdikorb era, to a new one, perhaps heterodoxy, as Waldo talked about. And then that points forward to further developments in public administration. So please do read all of them, and I think you're going to see how these readings do form something of a bridge between two eras of public administration. And then what I do want to do with the discussion is use this sort of as a midpoint reflection as a learning summary as to where we're at right now. So let me move into the readings a little bit. Okay, so you remember this. This is a slide from last week. This talked about the major components of Gulick's approach to government and administration from the Frye reading. And I don't want to belabor the point because we did talk about these last week, but Gulick had some very specific things to say about what he called a science of administration, or principles of administration. And so the question is, are there principles of administration? And Simon said there weren't. He called them something different. And so what he called these things, these principles of administration, was really a set of proverbs of administration. So what are proverbs? Proverbs are just wise sayings that we apply to, a given situation. A penny saved is a penny earned. And that's a great proverb to use, especially if you've saved your pennies during times of high interest and your penny turns out to be worth a heck of a lot more money than a penny, in 5 or 10 years from now. But if the penny you saved is in a time of very low interest, then maybe that proverb really doesn't apply. And that, in fact, was Simon's critique of Gulick. So he said what passes for principles of administration were really proverbs. So what were these proverbs of Gulick that Simon was critiquing? There were 4 main ones. General principles of administration. Administrative efficiency is increased by task specialization. Administrative efficiency is increased by the use of hierarchical authority. Administrative efficiency is increased by limiting span of control, and administrative efficiency is increased by organizing workers according to one of 4 things, either organizing workers and their organization according to purpose, according to process, according to clientele, or according to place or area. So I think you can see here there is a unifying theme of these principles, and it is the theme of efficiency. So what was Simon's critique, briefly? And of course you're going to read the article by Simon, but so this is just an overview. But first he said specialization is not a principle. So basically he said specialization just means different persons in an organization are doing different things, which is just simply reality. He said the real issue is how do we specialize, and how do we specialize in particular ways. Second, he said that unity of command in a hierarchy is typically not achieved. In fact, he pointed to the very real idea that there is functional guidance and then there is command guidance from different supervisors. So in a specialized organization, workers typically are getting direction from some functional chain. For example, they may be members, they may be a budget director, and they may get budget direction from laws and professional organizations to which they belong, and they get actual command guidance, if you will, from their boss. So unity of command is rarely achieved in a true, pure sense. Third, he said span of control is often contextual and situational. So when we say efficiency is improved by a small, limited span of control, there's no magic number for how many people a supervisor should have working for them. Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 10? Is it 20? It's contextual. It depends on the work being done. And finally, he said that organizing by principle, process, client, or place is not a principle either, as that gives no indication as to which one is preferable in different contexts. In fact, the same organization could be organized by any of these depending on the goals of the organization. And so it's not really a principle, it's just a statement of fact. But he doesn't say that these proverbs, as he calls them, should be thrown out. In fact, he says they can be salvaged by studying the organization. And so what he says that we should be doing to come to a science of administration, if we can actually derive a science of administration, is that we have to understand the administrative situation. So first he says we have to come up with a description of the administrative situation. Describe the organization. And he says the best way to describe the organization is by the kinds of decisions that are made by the organization. That is, the methods of decision making and the allocation of decision among workers and administrators in the organization. Second, he says we should diagnose the administrative situation. And by that he means that we have to understand not only the organization, but the individual members of the organization. We have to understand the limits on the ability to perform and the limits on the ability to make correct decisions. So what he says here is very important in public administration and other areas. First, he says that there are limits of rationality. So we may say that organizations respond rationally, but what Simon points out is that humans have limits on their rationality. In fact, he says elsewhere that humans are boundedly rational. They are rational, but they have bounds. There are limits on the decision-making speed. There are limits on individuals imposed by their own values and their own views of the purpose of their lives and the organization. And then we have to consider limits on the knowledge that each person has. So finally, the way he salvages these proverbs of administration is he says, now, once we understand the organization, in that sense, we can go back and understand how the principles affect, and can we weight them? For example, should more weighting be applied to span of control? Should more weighting be applied to unity of command? And he says now we can actually study the organization in closer to an objective way and understand how to improve that organization. So that is an overview of Simon. What I want you to do at this point is read and understand what you think he's saying vis-a-vis Gulick and the principles of administration. The second really important article I wanted you to look at is this one by Dahl. Now Dahl, what is Dahl criticizing here? Dahl is actually criticizing this idea that there is a science of administration, and he's questioning it. He's not actually contending that there can't be something called a science of administration. What he's saying is that in 1946, when he wrote this article, what he's saying is that up to that point, the assumptions upon which this science of administration have been built are flawed, and that people who study public administration need to recognize that as the baseline and move forward from there. So what are these flaws? Well, he said there were three problems in developing what up to that point was called a science of administration. First of all, he said there's a problem with normative values. Basically, he's saying that it is really difficult in the study of public administration to escape normative or ought to values. He points to efficiency. Now, Gulick, as we saw in Simon's critique, Gulick is very much concerned about efficiency, and he points to efficiency as the normative value. And he almost points it to as a neutral value, except that Dahl says it's not neutral. What he's questioning is efficiency the most important goal? And he asks then, if it is, then what about democratic processes that aren't necessarily efficient? So he talks about public involvement. So if you have a city council, for example, and you're voting on a controversial issue, and 100 people want to come to your city council meeting and speak on that, is that very efficient? No, it isn't. As a matter of fact, your meeting is going to drag on for 4 or 5 or 6 hours. But is part of the democratic process. So why is efficiency the most important goal? That's Dahl's question. Perhaps it is, but why is it? Then he asks, can administrators truly ignore ends and focus only on means? So again, in a so-called science of administration, the administrator would say to an elected official, you simply tell me your ends and I will tell you the most efficient means to get there. But are ends and means always separable? Often they are indistinguishable, and there are values attached to both. Now, let me stop right here and look at the year that Dahl was writing, 1946. In fact, all these writings are post-war. So the world had just gone through a very horrific period, really a two-war period, if you can think of it that way. But in any event, World War II was a world-changing event. One of the things that had been noticed by public administration scholars is that the Nazi regime in Germany was in particular quite efficient. But if you separate ends from means, then are you acting morally and ethically as a public administrator? Many parts of what Nazi Germany did were done in very efficient ways, but were they doing the right things? And of course, most of us would agree that they weren't. So, in Dahl's mind, how can public administrators say, well, my job is to simply carry out in a neutral way the most efficient way of achieving the ends of elected officials? So the second problem that Dahl had was with this science of administration was public administration and human behavior. His critique is that the so-called science of administration is based on a view of human beings as completely rational creatures. And he says, no, do humans always behave rationally? No, because they have backgrounds and they have individual values that they hold. So can the values of the humans in an organization be separated from the administrative process? He ends this critique by saying the science of organization has learned too much from industry and not enough from Freud. So in other words, what he's saying is that we need to know more about how individual humans in the organization behave so that we can understand how to make the administration of the organization perform better. And then finally, his most damning critique, I think, is this idea of social setting. What he's saying is that the so-called science of administration up to that point is kind of radically decontextualized. He says that it is oriented towards American and to some extent British public administration, and not really paying attention to other cultures. So he goes at, and you'll read this in the article, he goes to length to demonstrate that even that the so-called British civil service model was not really transferable to the United States because of really vast differences between the history of the UK and the history of the United States. As alike as those cultures are, and as alike as they were even more then, it was still problematic to transfer that style of administration to the United States, let alone transferring administration as some kind of science to all countries. So what he said, what he's calling for really is more research. He's saying, really what we need is comparative public administration. And that has grown since 1946, certainly. But what he's saying is that he's questioning the existence of some universal science of administration. Now that was 1946, and certainly comparative public administration has grown in that 70-year period. But again, this is a watershed period in our scholarly area. And so finally, the piece I give you to read, I just give you excerpts from this book by Waldo called The Administrative State. So The Administrative State is a classic of public administration. That book is a classic of public administration. If you want a vacation book, maybe you could check this book out, and it's a great book. There's so much in it. It's so rich that I can't begin to do it justice. And I'm not even really going to try to do it justice, but I'm just going to go over a few things and help you point to what you should be looking at. Now, I asked you to read chapters 1 and chapter 11, but I also put in there chapters 6 and 7, so you can read those if you want. You might be interested in chapters 6 and 7 because I think they have some interesting things to say. But I required you to read chapters 1 and 11. So chapter 1 is a great overview of the state of public administration as Waldo saw it in 1948. He said, look, this is why public administrators and the science of public administration thinks the way it does. This is what has influenced our field up to this point. And so he's really calling for contextualization of public administration. So he says that we're striving for something called a great society. That not to be confused with the programs of Lyndon Baines Johnson in the 60s, which he called the Great Society. But notice this post-war hopefulness here. Really, World War II was seen as a war that destroyed fascism. We came up with the United Nations as a result of World War II, and there was great hope for the world that we could democratize the world. Of course, that turned out not to be the case, but at the time, there was still great hope for this. But he said, in America, public administration has been influenced by a number of things. First of all, he talks about the closing of the frontier, and that the effect that this had was that people realized that perhaps nature didn't have a design, but they thought, well, by human effort, we can create a better society through industrialization. He talks about the business civilization and the modern corporation in the United States. And what he's referring to is the influence of the business values, such as efficiency, into public administration. The modern corporation in its bureaucratic organization. He's talking about the coming of urbanization, and so how American society has tended to move away from ruralization to urbanization, and how this then necessarily affects how we view public administration and the work of government. He talks about our constitutional system, and I think that's very familiar to most of you, especially in terms of its view of separation of powers. He talks about the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, and what he means by that is how the factories have become much more standardized, and how does this affect our view of people and workers. And again, he talks about the advance of specialization, and he talks at length about prosperity, depression, and wars, and how the two wars and how the prosperity of the 20s and then the depression of the 30s affected how we view public administration. And he goes into length about this ideological framework. So Waldo is a proponent of democracy. Basically what he's saying is that public administrators, in his view, need to believe in democracy and the mission of America, which is really, as he saw it, spreading democracy and faith in progress and faith in science. Now, chapter 6, which I don't require you to read, but you might find interesting, is called Who Should Rule? And what he's talking about is the rise of what he calls the administrative man. And, what he's pointing out is that in the administrative state, we have a need for more expertise, more professional expertise. And who are these experts that will run this administrative state? And he outlines some of the qualifications and the characteristics that the administrative man will have, and you can see them there. Physical and intellectual stamina, education, concern with human relations and human values, committed to democratic values, and appropriately recruited and trained. And then in chapter 7, again, which I didn't require you to read, he talks about separation of powers. But this is an interesting chapter because in this chapter, basically he says, can administration and politics truly be separated? And in fact, he says no. Administration and politics cannot be separated. Only certain aspects of politics should be removed from administration. For example, the influence of electoral politics on how administrators respond and act. But basically what he is saying is that the administrative man, as he says, will be involved in the creation of policy. And so he goes back to this idea that there are 5 powers of government as he sees it. The executive power, the legislative power, the judicial power, which we're all familiar with. But he also adds the administrative power of government and the electoral power of government. So it's in what Waldo is saying is, yes, it's not just what's written in the Constitution, but it's how our government has evolved in terms of administration. So finally then in chapter 11, he wraps all this up. And basically what he says is, administration and democracy are partners. And so he comes down on the side of an administration that is committed to democracy, not an administration that will learn to sharpen a knife from a murderer, as Wilson talks about. Not an administration that will blindly carry out orders as contrasted with the recent Nazi regime in Germany, but an administration that is committed to democracy. So again, 3 readings here. They're all very important, and please spend some good time reading those, and you may go over them over and over again because to me they're that rich. Okay, so what? Again, I mean, we have to always be asking the so what question. And here's some questions, some so what questions to think about as you're reading these things. Can can we understand administration as a set of sterile universal principles, or are there even universal principles? Is efficiency the overriding normative value, or are there other normative values that we should be thinking about? Can we separate ends from means? Can we separate facts from values? And can administration within a democracy be separated from politics? And now, as we move further in the course, and as you move further in your coursework, we have to ask, where do all these questions lead in the 1940s? So in the post-World War II 1940s, where do these questions from Waldo and Dahl and Simon lead? I mean, we will see that they lead to things like new public administration in the 1960s. Perhaps they lead in a different way to new public management in the 1990s. Do they lead to different views on personnel management? Do they lead to views on what administrators do as integrators? I think it's very interesting that in 1948, Waldo is talking about public administrators, executives as integrators. I mean, that's almost identical to what we're talking about now when we talk about networked governance, that administrators are integrators. It's almost identical to what the Reinventing Government movement and New Public Management talked about in the 90s with executives as people who steered and didn't row. And views on how other academic disciplines relate to public administration. We're seeing all these things in these writings, these classic writings of the late 1940s. So, leading up to that, here's where I want you to go with this week 9 discussion in this abbreviated week again. So I'm asking you to get this in by Friday night at midnight, Friday, October 22nd, the end of the day on Friday. And responses to each other, to your peers, are not required. If you see something that really strikes you, please do respond to each other. I'd welcome that, but it's not required for grading. I want to use this week kind of as a mid-course learning summary, if you will. And here's the 3 questions I want you to think about. So, thinking about the past 9 weeks and all the literature we've studied so far in the course, I'd like you to say what has surprised you and talk about why. And then I'd like you to think about the literature again and mention what has confirmed your views on public administration, the views you already held, and why. And then, kind of opposite to that question, I'd like you to think about what connections or disconnections do you see in theory and practice. And when I say practice, I'd like you to use your own practice or the practice of someone you may know. And that's it for this week. Again, it's a short week. I'm really looking forward, as always, to reading the thoughts you have, because I think we really have some great discussions going on. And I think thinking about all this literature really is very helpful for the rest of your coursework as you move along, but it's very helpful for us, really, as public administrators, to always be thinking about why we're doing what we're doing. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'll see you at the end of the week. Thanks.